In the late summer of 9 AD, Varus's legions are getting ready to return to their winter quarters on the Rhine. Arminius begins to play a dangerous double game. He's preparing a plan to attack Varus's legions on the march back to the Rhine, while carrying on with his duty as an officer in the auxiliary cavalry. Varus and Arminius are close, almost like father and son. Later, they will reproach Varus for having been too trusting. But to Varus, Arminius is a Roman. His loyalty cannot be questioned. Behind his back, Arminius is wooing the warriors of the Germanic tribes in the dark forests. As a priestess prays to the gods and confidently predicts a great victory, Arminius concentrates on the huge practical challenge of defeating the Romans. Even if the gods are on their side, the tribes will have no chance if they meet the Romans in open battle. When he fought beside them in Pannonia, he watched the legions advance with such force and with such discipline and order in every unit that the tribes would be defeated if they faced them directly. A tribal chieftain suggests attacking the Romans on the march, while their line stretches like a long thin worm across the plains. Arminius reminds them that Varus has 3 legions. That's nearly 20,000 men. The tribes had neither the men nor the weapons for such an attack. They'd be sure to fail, but the Romans are terrified of the Germanic forests. They hate the marshes and the narrow valleys. They must be invited to enter the forests.
Arminius was in a very good position. He knew the Roman army well. He'd been on campaigns crushing the great Pannonian rebellion where the Romans had to fight a long, tough war. And he had another advantage. The Romans trusted him. He was a Roman knight, a Roman officer. He must have had a great deal of charisma. People must have thought, this is the man who can make the changes we want in Germania.
Rumors have reached the Romans that Germanic tribes are planning to rebel. Perhaps the legions should be marching in battle order. When Varus asks Arminius, he says it's just a rumor. But if Varus desires it, he'll scout the territory with his auxiliaries. Varus is satisfied, and all thoughts can turn to the distant homeland. The night before the march is due to start, the chieftain of the Cherusci comes to the Roman camp. Segestes opposes the plan to attack the legions, and Varus has invited him to a farewell meal.
Segestes saw
that Arminius was putting his own people, the Cherusci and the neighboring tribes, into serious danger. Quite a number of senior members of the Cherusci thought that Arminius's hopes of succeeding were really not that great at all.
Segestes takes a huge risk. He tries to warn Varus that a conspiracy and an uprising are planned against him and the Roman legions. Varus can't imagine who could be that foolhardy. Segestes points to Arminius. On a September morning in the year 9 AD, Arminius leaves the camp with part of his auxiliary cavalry. Varus has dismissed Segestes' warning and given Arminius free hand to act as he wishes. After this first warning, there was no time for a second, the Roman sources say. The senior Roman commanders aren't as confident as Varus. But they can't see what Arminius could do, even if he were disloyal. Everyone has the same thought, to cross the forest safely and get back to the warmth and comfort of the winter quarters along the Rhine. Arminius is committed. There's no way back. The clatter of arms and the marching feet of thousands of legionaries could be heard deep in the forest as the 17th, 18th and 19th legions march out of their summer camp. The mood is light-hearted. A few more days of hardship in the wilderness, and then the camps on the Rhine, with wine, women and song, games and baths. Maybe Varus already sees himself back in Rome, enjoying a wealthy and contented retirement. He's marching to his doom, with all of his 22,000 soldiers and their support units. The giant column probably takes the usual route, south from the river Weser, around the foothills of the Teutoburg forest, to the river Lippe, across that, and onto the Rhine. That's how it should be. We still don't know how Arminius persuaded Varus and the legions to change their route. The Roman sources tell us simply, when Arminius and his auxiliaries were sent on ahead, they killed Roman troops stationed in their homeland. Arminius and his auxiliaries are still wearing Roman armor. The Roman soldiers see them as allies. In a surprise attack, they have no chance at all. Burn the towers. The auxiliaries torch the observation towers the Romans have erected at the edge of their marching routes. Arminius makes sure his attacks won't go unnoticed. At the end of their first day's march, the legions reach the foothills of the Teutoburg forest. The land is flat, the weather is dull but dry, and the troops are making good progress. And this is the moment Arminius burns the watchtower. Halt! How would Varus react? The Romans ask themselves what it can mean. Varus concludes that the rumors of an uprising were not groundless after all. Arminius must have come into conflict with rebels. Roman commanders in Germania would normally avoid entering forests or marshlands with their troops. If they had to cross a marsh, they would lay down a wooden walkway first. These were the Pontis Longi, the long bridges described by Roman historians. None has yet been found, but they were probably similar to the walkways the Germanic tribes constructed. This one is almost 3,500 years old. Built by the tribes living near the Vennermarsch, close to Osnabrück. On day 2 of the march, Varus makes a fatal mistake. He departs from the usual route and directs his legions into the forests. He's hurrying to Arminius's aid to nip the rebellion in the bud. The Cheruscan's plan is working. The Teutoburg Forest. Then as now, these highlands in northwest Germany are known for their craggy outcrops, impenetrable valleys, and dense forests. It's a nightmare for Roman soldiers, and impassable for an army of 22,000 men. Progress is painfully slow. Sliding in the mud and stumbling over tree roots, the soldiers can't stay in formation. Weighed down by their armor and weapons, the legionaries become more and more weary with each step. The supply wagons and the civilians slow their progress even more. Why Varus insists in penetrating ever deeper into the forest remains a mystery. Centurions do all they can to speed up the stragglers, with mixed success. The tribesmen know their way around the forests. Armed with just spears, axes, and swords, they can appear from all directions at once, moving silently along well-trodden, well-disguised paths. Arminius maneuvers his men into position in the undergrowth. The Romans notice nothing. Long before they get to look an enemy in the face, the Romans are weakened by their struggle against the forest. Cassius Dio writes, even before the attack, the Romans were in enough trouble felling trees, laying walkways, and building bridges to advance. Precisely the situation Arminius intends to create.
It was all happening pretty much as Arminius planned it. He was able to prepare his little surprises for the Romans along the route. He could choose the moment when they were too far from their usual route to turn back after the first attacks. They would say, we have to go on, we keep marching. And that way they were walking further and further into the trap.
Historians can't agree how many warriors Arminius was able to mobilize to fight Varus. It's hard to imagine the total came anywhere near the numbers of Varus's 3 legions. The Roman column has now become extremely stretched. Another advantage for the tribesmen. Their weapons are clearly inferior to the Romans. Axes, swords, wooden spears, and simple shields.
The tribesmen didn't necessarily need superiority in numbers. Because they were attacking the Romans in a long column, they could choose the place for the assault. Say, for example, 3,000 legionaries are marching along a narrow front in a 2-kilometer-long column, accompanied by wagons and mules, with people at the rear weighed down by packs, and they're suddenly attacked by 5,000 tribesmen. The tribesmen have both the element of surprise and, at that point, considerable numerical superiority.
Arminius has one further crucial advantage. Legions crossing difficult country are given protection for their flanks, auxiliary cavalry, Germanic mercenaries that he commands. And they have joined the rebellion. Varus cannot guess that the very forces that are protecting his flank will be the first to attack his legions. The warriors storm down from their hiding places in the hills. They are absolutely silent. Only the distant thunder of their feet betrays their presence. At that moment, the auxiliaries change sides. The attack finds the Romans entirely unprepared. There's barely time to raise the alarm. The Germans fight more with their bodies than with their weapons, a Roman historian says. In the chaotic confusion of civilians and supply wagons, it's impossible to bring up reinforcements. The tribesmen and the auxiliaries attack from both sides, giving the Romans no chance to regroup. The most powerful army in the ancient world is defenseless. There are no armies marching in formation. This is just hit and run. The surprise has been total. Centurions have been cut down even before they can gather their troops into action. They couldn't fight back. But what do their enemies plan? Are they after booty, or is it a major attack? All they know is that the enemy are present in large numbers. And where is Arminius? Varus decides the only option is to press on. As soon as they find a suitable place in the forest, they will halt, gather the legions, and build an emergency camp. According to Tacitus, the Romans managed to advance through the forest. Then, all three legions worked together to build a temporary camp. No single legion had been destroyed. One battle had been lost. The war could still be won.
Varus
At this point, Varus was still following standard Roman procedure. He built a fortified encampment as well as he could in the terrain and given the state of his troops. And it was the right thing to do, because the enemy was nearby and he had to ensure that his men could at least rest that night without having to fight off non-stop attacks. The wall and the ditch, with sentries placed behind it, was precisely what was needed to make an impression on the enemy and make them think twice before launching an attack.
Behind the ramparts, they tend to the wounded. While the commanders consider their options. They realize their losses are worse than they thought. 8 cohorts have been wiped out. The choices are poor. Maybe they should make a break for it. But marching on could be suicide. Varus must decide. Betrayed by the man he trusted most. His commanders urge him to stay behind their defenses. Messengers can be sent to the Halten and Xanten garrisons for reinforcements. There's no alternative. They need help. Varus rejects their advice. They can wipe out the barbarians once they leave the forest. He instructs his commanders to abandon the civilians and destroy the baggage train. Nothing must slow them down. The legions will march on at daybreak. The orders are clear and will be obeyed without question. It is a serious strategic error. The Germanic forces immediately spot the burning baggage train.
Dann pack ich direkt an seiner Gurgel.
Arminius.
A scout reports to Arminius. The Romans have ejected the civilians from the camp and are destroying their supplies. Some of the chieftains want to pillage before everything is burned. They know they owe their men booty. This is their chance. Arminius is furious. They could lose everything they've achieved so far. The tribes have sworn to obey him. He promises to lead them to victory if they obey his orders.
Arminius's achievement here was in making his non-too-disciplined forces follow rational, deliberate tactics. Many of them would surely have seen this as cowardice, and they would have had to restrain themselves in order to go along with his plan.
Morally, Arminius's behavior may be dubious, but there's no doubt that he was a military genius and a man torn between two cultures. Realistically, he has no chance against the Romans, but he still went ahead with his attack. The next morning, the legions leave the camp in battle order. Varus abandons the civilians to their fate. Perhaps he expects the barbarians to massacre them and plunder the supplies and let his legions go free. But according to Tacitus, Arminius said that war is fought only against soldiers. This Germanic code of honor was based on sound reasoning.
If Arminius spared the civilians in the baggage train, that wouldn't have been for humanitarian reasons. It was a great opportunity to take them prisoner and then hold them to ransom. Trading in people, prisoners of war, is perfectly normal in warfare, because people mean manpower. And that's extremely valuable.
Menschenkraft ist etwas ganz Kostbares. Und deswegen sehe ich...
So I don't see that as evidence that Arminius was a man of integrity who was sparing civilians. He was simply being practical.
Sondern das hatte ganz praktische Züge.
On the third day, the weather turns. Torrential rain brings the legion's forced march to a halt. Their armor, now soaking wet and heavy as lead, makes the soldiers even less mobile than before. For Arminius and his men, this is perfectly normal weather. Cassius Dio writes, "Heavy storms broke out. While the Romans fought the elements, the barbarians moved into position, surrounding them on all sides." Arminius now unleashes an attack of appalling brutality. To the Romans, they must seem like evil spirits. There's no time for a heroic rearguard action. No time to look after the wounded. One chronicler wrote, "Caught in the bogs and the forests, the Romans were butchered man by man, by the same enemy they had butchered like cattle so many times before." And finally, in the chaos, Varus loses control of his legions. There are no generals left for the soldiers to follow. His army falls apart. In the space of 24 hours, Varus has faced 2 overwhelming attacks on his legions. He must have come to realize that victory is now beyond his grasp. He can only hope to avoid annihilation. One of his cavalry commanders finally reaches the scene of the massacre. He finds Varus at his wit's end. With no idea what to do. This could be the last chance to call for reinforcements. Numonius volunteers to break out with his cavalry to the nearest Roman stronghold before the horses are too exhausted to move. According to Roman historians, Numonius only wanted to save his own skin. He left the foot soldiers in the lurch and fled towards the Rhine. But fate took its revenge. As Paterculus recorded, death overtook the traitor on the way. Whatever Varus and Numonius may have planned, Arminius is a step ahead. Another trap awaits the fleeing cavalry. Not a single horseman will make it to the Rhine. Now the legionaries waste no time to get moving. Nothing matters but getting out of the forest. The tribesmen are always just behind them. They know they only have to drive the Romans forwards. And the legions stumble blindly on. But the night's forced march has done the trick. At last, 3 days after the Romans left their regular route, the forest gets lighter, the land gets flatter. At last, there's a glimmer of hope. The Romans are safe. Open country. If Varus had been counting on Numonius's cavalry, he realizes now that all hope is lost. And Arminius makes sure the Romans understand. They're still in the trap. Tracing their progress, we can assume that Varus and the remains of his legions moved north on the third day and marched over the Wiehan hills until they reached the North German plain. They turn west towards the Rhine. They're marching into a bottleneck just 80 meters wide between the Kalkrieser mountain to the south and a giant swamp to the north. Just a few years ago, archaeologists stumbled on the remains of a palisade wall. Behind these ramparts, Arminius and his men are thought to have waited in ambush for Varus for the final decisive blow. That's what the experts believe. From the earth in front of the wall, they dug up thousands of nails and pieces of lead of Roman origin, domestic objects like scissors, but also spear tips and tools. Is this the site of the last battle? Pride of place goes to a Roman cavalry officer's ceremonial mask.
Die Funde von Kalkriese sind zwar sehr zahlreich, aber das Gesamtgelände...
Though there are very many finds at Kalkriese, the whole terrain is quite small, and sources tell us of a central event involving 3 legions and at least 10 to 15,000 men, if not 20,000. So far, the finds at Kalkriese don't reflect those numbers.
Even if conclusive proof is still lacking, Kalkriese was soon declared the definitive location of the battle. The museum is a magnet for tourists. Kalkriese's supporters base their case on the dates of the coins found at the site.
Judging by the current evidence, there's a great deal more that argues for Kalkriese than against it. We found coins with Varus's likeness on them. So these coins must have found their way into the ground at the time Varus was governor, that is, 7 to 9 AD. We can be sure about that. The second point is, we found no coins that were minted after 9 AD among the 1,800 or so that we have dug up.
Scientists have found traces of a battle along a 10-kilometer stretch of the Wiehan Mountains. This allows us to reconstruct a clear scenario for the third decisive day.
The lie of the land in Kalkriese over the whole area we're working on makes it clear that the Roman army was moving from east to west, and that the tribesmen attacked them repeatedly from the lower slopes of Kalkriese Hill. We can demonstrate this over a zone of at least 10 kilometers. We can show that the tribesmen kept harrying the marching Roman army with small-scale darting attacks.
When the Romans emerge from the forest and form up in the open, Arminius gathers his men for the final battle. The legions have nothing to counter the tribe's cry of freedom or death. Now they scent victory. More and more tribesmen are going over to Arminius. Even Roman allies like Segestes, through opportunism, not conviction.
We shouldn't get ideas about the honorable Germanic peoples. That's an 18th and 19th century idea. Archaeology can bring us down to earth here. We see from the battlefield that there was plunder, probably the stripping of corpses. Taking booty was very important. It was an opportunity to enrich themselves with silver, gold, bronze, and even iron.
The battle is a victory over the Romans that no one would have thought possible. Close to 15,000 soldiers lie dead in the forest. The few survivors drag themselves across the plain, waiting to be captured and slaughtered. There could be no greater humiliation for the superpower that is Rome. Arminius' victory is unprecedented. Of the Roman historians, it was Tacitus who really understood its significance. Arminius was indisputably the liberator of Germania. Varus would become the scapegoat for the greatest military disaster Rome had ever experienced. He commits suicide on the battlefield. As Paterculus disdainfully comments, this commander had more courage to die than to fight. In the end, he ran himself through. Even after 3 days of fighting, the bloodshed is not at an end. The victorious tribesmen pass over the battlefield, ripping armor and weapons from the bodies of the dead and dying. They sacrifice captured legionaries to the gods that granted them victory. The standards of the legions are stamped into the mud, and Varus's corpse is defiled. His head goes on a terrible journey to the Emperor Augustus in Rome. If the tribes stay loyal, Arminius can build on his triumph. In his hour of victory, he is the undisputed leader of the Germanic tribes. But will the Romans seek revenge?
The short-term result of Arminius' victory was that Augustus abandoned his plans to occupy Germania as far as the river Elbe. That's clear. Augustus had to fight plenty of internal battles, and he had a tough time imposing his policy. Plenty of people in Rome who said, "We can't accept this humiliation, we must hit back." But Augustus believed it wasn't worth it. Germania didn't have enough to offer the Romans. The tribes should be left to massacre each other. We'll make sure we always support the weaker side, so they can keep fighting the stronger ones. And we're sitting pretty, and the Germanic tribes are no longer a problem for us.
6 years later, in 15 AD, Roman legions returned to the site of the disaster. Tacitus describes the terrible discoveries made by the legions under the command of Germanicus. Bleached bones were lying all over the forest floor. Skulls were nailed to trees. These were the barbarians' altars, on which they slaughtered the tribunes and centurions. Almost 2,000 years later, archaeologists in Calcrisa discover bones buried in a mass grave. They're all the bones of men. They show signs of violence. They were exposed to the elements for a long time before being buried. Could this be proof that Calcrisa was the site of the battle? Perhaps the archaeologists have confirmed the truth of Tacitus' account 2,000 years later. But not everyone is satisfied, and the search for the battlefield goes on. Germanicus failed in his attempt to take revenge, to crush the Germanic tribes. Arminius fought more battles against the Romans and kept them at bay. Germanicus was ordered back to Rome. The superpower withdrew to the Rhine. Germania would never become a Roman province. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was one of the most significant of the ancient world. It resulted in a fundamental and long-lasting cultural divide that split Europe in two. Here on the Rhine, where the Xanten Archaeology Park now stands, was a Roman town with temples, an amphitheater and baths. This was a center of antique civilization. On the other side of the river, the Germanic tribes remained what they were, free and volatile.
Germania simply carried on as it had done before the Romans came. Germania was anything but a unified nation. It was many centuries before bigger tribal groupings formed, like the Alemans or the Franks, who were finally strong enough to bring down the Roman Empire in the West.
Dann wiederum stark genug gewesen sind, das Römische Reich auch im Westen in die Knie zu zwingen.
Arminius paid for his ambition of creating a Germanic kingdom with his life. He was poisoned, probably by his own family. Without a common enemy, the land fell back into a state of permanent feuding. No chieftain could tolerate another exceeding him in power and influence, a situation that would characterize this part of Europe until modern times.
Das Problem der Könige,
the problem for the kings was always the aristocracy. And that problem lasted in Germany until the reign of Frederick William IV. When he was offered the throne in 1848, he said, "Yes, but what do the other princes think?" He doesn't care what the people think, but he's afraid of his peers, the other crowned heads of Germany. So we can say that this sense of envy, this sense of rivalry with the aristocracy, becomes a permanent permanent factor in Germany.
Deutschland zumindest ein Dauerzustand.
Arminius was long regarded as the German hero. The adoration reached its zenith with the completion of the Hermann Monument in 1875. The sword points towards France, Germany's arch-enemy in the 19th century, even though Arminius had fought against Rome. But that doesn't minimize his achievement of challenging and defeating Rome at her peak. But we would know nothing of this hero if his enemies hadn't told his story. It was Tacitus, Rome's greatest historian, who wrote the words that immortalized this barbarian tribesman. He was undefeated in war. His life lasted 37 years, and his power, 12. Today, they still sing his praises among the barbarian peoples.